Hello, hello. How's everyone doing today? Oh, no. Okay. Almost exited. Okay, awesome. So today we're talking about emotional labor or just working hard emotionally. Because there's the more like technical stuff, technical terms of emotional labor, which we'll also go through. But then there's also our experience of why we feel like we are working so hard emotionally. And for so many clinicians, this is such a source of overwhelm, of stress, of feeling absolutely exhausted. Sometimes it's one of the reasons that or not one of the reasons, it's one of the biggest reasons, usually the main factor that ends up in burnout as well. And emotional exhaustion is actually one of the key what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, one of the key factors of components of burnout. I will think of the word. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about different aspects of this. We did a poll in the Facebook group, and I just asked you to vote on which one of these things feels like the biggest contributor to you feeling emotionally exhausted or just feeling like you're working really hard emotionally. And so from like the highest score to the lowest, we had managing or regulating patients' emotional states. The second was putting on a certain face, like feeling like you have to have a certain emotion, have a certain vibe that you're not necessarily genuinely feeling. And then caring for or being compassionate towards patients. And then emotional labor at home. So those were the different ones, and I've sort of combined them, like managing and regulating people's emotions at work and at home, and then putting on a certain face and being compassionate towards people. So emotional labor is pretty much the same, whether it's with patients or in our home life. I just wanted to get a sense of which one was contributing more. And for most clinicians, it tends to be more workplace stuff than home stuff. But I know that home stuff can also be one of, a big contributor to that. Okay. So we're looking at one of the big terms that comes up with this is emotional regulation. And one of the things that was interesting is a lot of people told me that they're doing emotional labor. And when they went into detail about it, it was more about being triggered emotionally, right? And so this is one of the big ones where we feel like we're working hard emotionally. And in reality, it's more because we're being, I guess, triggered or like some sort of emotional activation. And so one of the things that we might look at when we are being so activated is emotional regulation. So that might be one of the big components, right? Like I feel like I'm constantly having to regulate my own emotions, and you might feel like that's very hard work emotionally, or just the actual emotional roller coaster that you go through on a daily basis just feels emotionally exhausting. So emotional regulation in its kind of simplest term just means exerting control over your emotional state. And it's a skill, a bunch of skills that we can learn so that we have more control over our emotional state. And we often are triggered by things and then we want to regulate our emotions or feel better. So we might turn towards something that just in that moment makes us feel better. Maybe we like do a few breaths, right? Maybe we do like a little mini meditation or some sort of like visualization. Otherwise, other times we might count, to 10 or something like that before we respond. Sometimes we have things in the moment, but those can be incredibly helpful. But sometimes I find that that people only have that option. And so they don't actually know how to, in the long term, be less triggered. They just know how to sort of calm themselves a little bit in that moment to be able to just carry on with life. So we want to look a little bit closer and think about like why we had that emotional response. And we might see it as just like, it's just normal. It's just they said this, they did this, they had this emotion, therefore I felt a certain way. And we might explain it like that. But when we are triggered by something, when we are emotionally activated by something, I often say it tells me more about you as the clinician when you are activated by something that happens in practice. It tells me more about your brain than it does about your patients or whoever activated you, right? And the reason is because our brain has a certain meaning making of a certain situation, right? Where this is an interesting conversation I had recently where, someone said, someone's aware of my fees, but then they ask, how much do I owe you? And so they say, that makes me feel like they're implying that I should give them a discount. But that's their meaning making of it, right? The patient never said that. But because of how their brain makes that meaning of that certain situation, they will have a certain emotional response. And so we can start to look at, okay, one of the ways that I do this is, let's assume that there's some clinician out there who had the exact same scenario as you do, but wasn't emotionally activated. Like they just were kind of neutral. They don't even remember that it happened. They were kind of indifferent about it. It didn't even like register as this thing that happened. If you imagine a clinician like that, who had the exact same scenario, but was very neutral emotionally, what do you think they think differently to you? What might they believe that is different to you? And then we can start to access other perspectives. Often when we are so emotionally activated, we are activating what is called our psychological immune system. Our psychological immune system is essentially like our normal immune system, where it detects threats or perceived threats, and then it protects you against that. And it has this big emotional reaction, right? And we have certain threats that tend to activate us. And this is why it's so different for every person, because we have our own reasons why we might see things as a threat, based on our past experiences, based on what we learned about how the world works, how we should be behaving, what we learned about like what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what it means when someone does something, what was modeled to us. So we all have our own psychological immune system that will be activated by completely different things. There are common patterns, but we are often triggered by different things based on our psychological immune system. So the types of threats that generally activate this is what's known as the SCARF threats, SCARF. S stands for status or identity. So if you think that, doing a certain thing makes you seem like a bad person, or someone that doesn't care, or someone that's selfish, or someone that's lazy, you're not going to want to do that thing. You're going to protect yourself against that at all costs. And it's a similar thing when someone else does something that you perceive as those same things. So status or identity, certainty, right? Like we might be completely miserable at a job, but we might still not choose to leave because we see that as a threat to our certainty. Like, at least I know here, what to expect. The unknown is like completely, it's uncertain. I don't know what to expect. A threat to our autonomy, like when it feels like someone has kind of dominated or they have taken away your agency, you might respond in a very activated way because you perceive a threat to your autonomy and your agency and your control in that situation. The other one is, the R is relatedness, so relationships. I might struggle to set a boundary because I am worried about what your reaction is going to be, and I'm worried that it's going to jeopardize our relationship. And so I just grit my teeth and I smile and I do things for you even though I don't want to do them, and I feel resentful, but it's better than setting the boundary which might jeopardize our relationship. And the last one, F, is fairness. So you might have a threat, a perceived threat to your fairness. Like, let's say a patient canceled last minute and you are so activated by that because you feel like they're being very unfair, that now you have to take on the load, right? Like you have to suffer because they chose to do something last minute. It can be a threat to your fairness. And that's just, one of the examples of like another clinician might completely not see that as a threat to their fairness because they know that they're going to charge that person for canceling last minute. So there's no unfairness at all, right? So it's just an example of another clinician who might not be activated by that because they're not having that fairness threat activated. So it's just something to start looking at, like, why am I so activated by this? What is the story behind that? What is the narrative? What do I believe about this? What do I think the underlying meaning of their behavior is, right? Like if a patient, one of the examples a clinician gave was a patient keeps arriving late, right? That is in and of itself very neutral. Patient arrives late to the appointment. One clinician who is like, yeah, patients often arrive late, have absolutely no feelings about it, no thoughts about it, right, would respond emotionally very differently to a clinician that believes when a patient arrives late, it means they don't respect me and they don't care about this and they're not taking responsibility for their health or whatever it is. We make all these these judgments about them or what we think they are judging about us. Okay, so in the long term, when we get clearer on like why this is happening and we start to address it from that kind of deeper level in some sense, it doesn't mean we have to go super deep and like into our childhood and all of that. I just mean like just that layer underneath of like, I'm not just responding to this situation. There's something more going on here. Almost any time you are so emotionally activated that you can't even like access your normal thinking and your like solutions and stuff like that, when you just feel like almost taken over by that emotional reaction, that's a sign that it's not about just the facts of what is happening right here. There's something underlying that, some meaning making that your brain is making about what is happening. And so when we actually go through this process, what can happen is that we start to not be triggered as much by certain things because we understand why, and we've worked through those beliefs and those thoughts, and we've found new perspectives, new ways of thinking. We've practiced those new ways of thinking. We've let go of a lot of the like psychological protection mechanisms because of that work, and so we have less necessity to keep on like regulating our emotions, right? So if we only learn to calm ourselves when we are freaking out, we don't necessarily get that. We just sort of like keep going, keeping activated and calm ourselves down, activated, calm ourselves down, activated, calm ourselves down. Whereas when we go a little bit deeper, then we can actually get a little bit more of a stable sort of trajectory, that we're not just that huge roller coaster, but we're relatively stable and neutral in practice. We might not always be like super positive, and sometimes we try and jump to that, but we're just a bit more neutral, a bit more calm, a bit less just emotionally pulled around by whatever is happening around us. And then the second one was managing or regulating other people's emotional states. So if we think of regulation as controlling emotional states, we just need to know that we cannot control other people's emotional states. So when you're trying, it's not an act of generosity. It's an act of like, I'm trying to control how you feel. And it makes total sense. Don't worry, I'm not judging for that. There are very valid reasons why we do that. But just know, it's just sometimes good to just know that, like, okay, I'm trying to control, sometimes just phrasing it in that way, I'm trying to control how they feel. We can do what they call co-regulation, especially if, like, obviously if it's little kids, we're not like expecting them to, regulate their own emotions if it's not psychologically, in terms of maturity, appropriate. And we can influence other people's emotions, right? Like if a patient is so unbelievably like frantic and stressed, we can, with our emotional state of calm, we can help them regulate their emotions. But it's for them. It's not for us. Often we're doing it because we are uncomfortable with how they feel. We want to have a certain outcome. We want them to feel a certain way. And I think it's Brené Brown that talks about this, but she talks about how she noticed that she was struggling to, what she called, like, literally sometimes and figuratively, sitting with her kids in the dark. So she tells a story of when her child was really upset and she was sitting in the dark in her room, and she said like her desire was so strong to like turn on the light and be all like cheery and like, try and get her child to feel better and like, reframe things or whatever. And she said, like, we really need to practice the act of sitting in the dark with that person and being able to be with people when they are experiencing a negative emotion or like a strong emotion, without trying to fix it or push it away or try and, create a different emotion, right? If someone else wants to feel differently, they can then regulate themselves, and you can co-regulate, you can be there to support them. But again, it's for them because they want to feel differently, not because you want them to feel differently. And just notice when you start to get into that. We don't have to shame ourselves or judge ourselves for this. It's just to notice like, oh, I'm actually trying to control their emotional state for me and not actually for them. And so sometimes we just feel really uncomfortable with other people feeling a certain way emotionally. The flip side of this as well is, if we feel responsible for other people's emotions, if we feel responsible for controlling their emotions, then we also often see it as they are controlling our emotions. And so also noticing how often we say like our emotional states are because of something someone else did, right? Or said, or how they felt. So we want to, we talked about this in the self-authorship workshop, but we want to, I drew two little stick figures in the same bubble, and that's kind of what happens when we are what they call like codependent, or when we people please, is we see us and other people in the same bubble. So their emotions become our emotions, or their emotions become ours to fix. It means something for what we do, and we have to try and solve that. We are responsible for the emotions, and the reverse, that they are responsible for our emotions. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create our own little bubble, and not in a way that separates us. This can actually help us be more connected and more present to other people, because we're not seeing them as responsible for our feelings, and we're not seeing us as responsible for their feelings. But we want to separate out that little bubble and be in your own bubble and know that you are responsible for your own emotional state. And when someone else is upset, it doesn't mean something for you. They can be in their bubble being upset. You can be there to support them. You can keep calm. You can do whatever you need to do. But there's no like this, there's no, or at least much less, sort of enmeshment in the two people and their emotions and their behaviors and their beliefs. Okay. Just making sure that I say everything I wanted to say. Okay. And then just on that, when we talked also about self-authorship and people-pleasing, this is by Hayley McGee. She talks about how you know when it's people-pleasing versus being like truly altruistic, right? And being generous is when it's transactional, like I'm going to give you this so that you give me XYZ. And sometimes that's not material things, but it's sometimes like I'm going to do this so that you validate me, or so that you like me, or so that you accept me, or you give me affection. So it's transactional in some way. You're expecting something in return for whatever you're doing. It's compulsive. So you don't necessarily feel like you have a choice. You're doing it because you literally don't feel like you could do anything else. Like when you're booking that patient that phones you outside your hours, and you promise you weren't going to take patients outside your hours, but someone phones you and they're like, oh my gosh, I really need an appointment. You literally feel like you don't have a choice in that moment. You just say yes out of compulsion. When it's obligation, so I do this because if I don't do it, I'm going to feel guilty. I feel obligated to do this. That's not genuine altruism, right? So transaction, compulsion, obligation, and then loss aversion. I'm doing this so I don't lose you. This can be applied to patients, right? We do stuff purely because we don't want them to leave our practice or to lose them as patients. And so we might do stuff that we feel resentful about or feel frustrated or angry about, but we're just doing it because we're scared of losing them as a patient. Okay. So the other one was putting on a certain face. So this is actually one of the more technical definitions of emotional labor, is almost like pretend emotioning. Like you feel, let's say you feel really sad or down because of something that happened in your own life, and now you're going to practice and you feel like you have to look enthusiastic and you have to smile the whole time, or you feel let's say emotionally activated by something a patient says, that you are really frustrated with them, but you feel you have to like remain calm, and the customer is always right or the patient is always right, and you have to just let them do their thing without saying anything. So anything where you almost like have to pretend. There was this book, I always forget what the name is, but there was this beautiful phrase of air hostesses who were, they had to smile and like look all friendly and always be like looking like they're enthusiastic and wanting to help. And there was this phrase that said something along the lines of like their smile was no longer their own. So they didn't own their smile anymore. It was like being used for a certain outcome. And that always stuck with me. So it's that kind of idea. And if we think about it, like, let's say your emotional state is here and you feel like you have to be here. Whatever or however big that gap is, that's how much emotional labor you have to expend in order to pretend that emotion, right? And so when we are looking to do less emotional labor, we have two options. In this particular, I'll give you another example of what we can do. But in this particular example, we have those two sides of the equation that we're working with, right? So either we can have the expectation of how we should be a little bit lower. So maybe we don't have to be all smiley and happy all the time. Maybe we don't have to be overly enthusiastic about everything. Maybe we don't have to look like what our patient is saying is absolutely like the most fascinating story we've ever heard, right? Maybe that expectation of how we have to be in practice can be lowered a little bit. That's the one way to make this gap smaller. The other way is that we feel better, right? So we feel closer to what we actually are displaying in practice. So if it's like ecstatically happy that we think we have to be, and we are at least quite happy, that's much less emotional labor than if you are like really miserable and you have this expectation that you need to be this bright, bubbly person. So you have those two, one or both of those you can use to be expending less emotional labor. The other thing that was really interesting is that they found that there are two different kinds of acting, they call it. So like the superficial acting and deep acting. So superficial acting just means that you sort of like are pretend emotioning, but it's very kind of superficial. You're not, you're almost just like really faking it. The deep acting was almost meant when we look deeper and we actually kind of in some way produce that emotion. And they call that deep acting. And they said often when people can find some sort of reason in themselves, like deeper in themselves for why they're doing this, right? Like let's say your patient is really distressed about a certain procedure that they have to do, and you are pretend like calm. You are not necessarily feeling calm yourself, but you like put on this emotion of calm, but you know that it's so meaningful. You are choosing to do that because you know that it's going to be so helpful to your patient. So when we find like a more meaningful reason for pretending those emotions and kind of finding a deeper well, a deeper source of that emotion, we are more protected against burnout and being emotionally exhausted than when we just feel like we're just faking it the whole day. So those are just some interesting factors to consider. And then the last one I wanted to talk about was caring for or being compassionate to our patients. I'm just going to take a sip of water. You're welcome to give your scenarios. We had a few cool examples from clinicians, so you're welcome to add them. And also, especially if you're like not sure which of these applies best to you, we can always brainstorm with your unique situation. And yeah, it's always helpful when people talk about their experiences and that other clinicians also know, okay, some people are also triggered by this emotionally, or sometimes the opposite, right? Like someone will describe a situation. We actually had that the other day in one of our sessions. There were two clinicians from the exact same practice, and one clinician was like, yeah, she like reported this thing about like, this is how it is in our practice, and the other clinician was like, oh, I've never actually gotten that sense. And it was such a good example of how two people can be in the exact same practice and get completely different like narratives about certain things because of how their brain makes meaning about things. Okay. And by the way, it's not always because of that. Like, it's almost like in a family, right? We say like we have the same parents, and I think it's Gabo Mate who always says like, no, you don't have the same parents because you are different people as children, and so your parents will respond to you differently based on the person that you are. And so I think it's a similar thing in practice, right? Like our boss might be the same person, but depending on what relationship he has with different clinicians, he might actually be in some ways a different person to the different clinicians, right? So it's not only that, but it just can be sometimes a really interesting example of how two different people can make completely different meaning out of the same situation. Okay, so caring for or being compassionate to our patients. This is one of the things that is very much misunderstood, because we talk a lot about compassion fatigue, and I think that's often what is quite misleading, where we think then if it's fatigue from being compassionate, we're like, okay, well then the solution is to be less compassionate, so I need to care less about patients. But actually, again, caring less and being kind of emotionally detached is actually one of the features, that was the word I was looking for earlier, one of the features of burnout. So compassion is not actually the problem. It's not the fact that we care too much about our patients that burns us out or makes us emotionally exhausted. And we often use that term. We are, oh, I just care too much about my patient. I just need to care less, right? And firstly, it's not going to be very effective, because like, who wants to work on caring less about people? Like, that's not, we're not going to succeed at that, right? Like, that feels against our morals and what we want to be as clinicians. So compassion is just the witnessing of someone's pain, the witnessing of someone's suffering, and when we can, doing whatever we can in that moment to help them in that suffering. And it is actually protective against burnout. So compassion is one of the things that we actually need to practice. But here's what happens is we actually have what they call empathic distress fatigue. So that is actually when we're thinking compassion fatigue, we're thinking burnout, we're thinking emotional exhaustion. What's really happening is empathic distress fatigue, which essentially means that we are feeling empathy, and a certain type of empathy, which is called affective empathy, which means I feel what you feel. So we just kind of take on whatever our patient's emotional state is, or in the home, we take on someone's emotional state. That's affective empathy. And then we feel so distressed because of how they are feeling. And it sounds crazy, but this is so common, and myself included, right? So we feel distressed because of their emotional state. And so we actually have empathic distress fatigue rather than compassion fatigue. And often we are so distressed, or rather, we can be distressed by their emotion either because we take it on and it just becomes our emotion, and we are distressed by that, and that's uncomfortable, or because we see it again as our role, our responsibility to fix their emotional state. And so when they're not feeling good emotionally, it's like, oh no, this is my responsibility to fix this. And so we can like do whatever we can to like fix it, but again, not from that true sort of genuine place where they are wanting that or they need that in that moment, but because we are so uncomfortable, we see it as our role to fix that. And so we feel like we're not doing our job if a patient is unhappy or they are upset or they are just feeling like having a terrible day, you know. Like if we don't see it as our responsibility to fix that, we are much more able to be present with them. We're much more able to just be with them in that discomfort and that pain and that suffering without trying to fix it. And I will say, even if that distress is because of you or because of something that they interpreted that you did, like let's say a patient interprets one of your actions as, oh, she doesn't care about me, and they're so like upset by that and they're so offended by the fact that you don't care about them, you can still be present with them and you can still say, or you can still have that in your mind of like, this is their interpretation of what happened, and I can totally be with them in that and say like, I can see why you might have felt that. I can see where you might have like gotten that from, or like why you interpreted it in that way. Here's what I actually meant by that, or here's, you know, what I was intending with that, or whatever it is. You can have that conversation with them without being I think we sometimes think that if a patient is accusing us of something or thinks a certain thing of us or judges us a certain way, that the like there is no other response other than to be defensive. But that's not true. We can see it as, oh, they're having this thing that's happening for them in their brain. They are believing certain things or thinking certain things, they're feeling certain things, and I can just be there with them without being defensive or trying to fix their emotions. Awesome. So those are the kind of like the main categories. And I just want to say again, like with all of this stuff, if this is something that you struggle with, it is totally, I don't want to say it's normal. It's common, but not normal. It's common, but not healthy, as we know from different things, right? But most of us were never taught these skills of emotional regulation, of how to deal with the emotional labor of our career, how to deal with, you know, what is called compassion fatigue, but essentially empathic distress fatigue. We're never taught how to do this or how to look deeper at like, why am I so triggered by something? I talk often about self-authorship, and we were talking about this in the workshop as well, that self-authorship is essentially a stage in our adult psychological development where we stop being, again, like we go from being in that bubble with other people to being in our own bubble. We start to get in the driver's seat. We start to have more agency over how we feel, how we think. We start to write that story instead of feeling like other people write that story for us, and we're just kind of pulled around by whatever they happen to be thinking, feeling, doing, etc. And 65% of adults never mature psychologically, which is crazy to think about that. Like most of the adults in your life are not psychologically mature. And it's not this like moral thing of like, you know, you're a better person if you're like more psychologically mature. But all of this stuff that we were talking about today all the stuff we're talking about are things that are related to this difference between being self-authored, or the one that comes before that is the socialized mind, which essentially means like you're more driven by external things. So you're more essentially that, like swept around by what other people think and feel, how their judgments about you. That's what is sort of directing your life. And then in self-authorship, you are the person directing your life. So most adults are not in that space. Your friends are not, your parents are usually not. So it's not about age and you just get more psychologically mature. These are actual like skills and tools that we need to use in order to become more psychologically mature. And most of us are just never taught this. Most of us don't have a space where this happens. So it's firstly to be compassionate towards yourself and to not judge yourself or shame yourself for that. But it's also to understand that most of the people around you are the same way. And so they almost just keep confirming these things to us. They also talk about their emotions being directed by other people's, right? They think it's totally justified that you are, like absolutely emotionally triggered by something, because they're like, yeah, that happens to me too, right? So I just want you to know that. And I think this is one of the reasons that I find it's so helpful to work with a coach, especially a coach that understands this process, because really anything that we're getting from the outside world is unlikely to be helpful in our psychological growth. Of course, we have people that can support us, and we have people that maybe are more psychologically mature to us than us, and that can be super helpful. But any kind of guidance along that, I like a lot of my clients say, like, we never really learned how to adult. We never learned how to, like, as some people say, like, get our shit together. But in some sense, we just never learn how to, like, do the humaning side, the adult side, the what some people might call soft skills side of things. We just learned, like, the technical skills of being a clinician. But there's so much more to that. And so if this is something that you would like to work on with me as your coach, and you would like to get to that point that you are not being, emotionally pulled around by whatever is happening in practice or at home, if you really want to learn these skills of emotional regulation and awareness of what's happening on a kind of deeper level psychologically, and then dealing with things like emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion, empathic distress fatigue, right? All of these things, the emotional labor, we work through all of that. So you can just send me a private message if coaching with me is something you're considering. I am still available for the next week and a half or so for this year. And then I will see you guys in January again. So this will be the last live likely for the year. I might do a short one next week. But yeah, in this next week and a half or so, just send me a DM. Let me know that you are considering coaching, and we will set up a call to go through the whole process of talking about, like, where you are now, where you're wanting to go, and we talk about what I feel is like the steps needed to get you there, and then we can talk about how coaching would look like, what coaching together would look like. Awesome. I hope that was helpful, and I will see you guys in the group. Thank you so much. Bye.